Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies at the Institute for Social Research. And I'm glad you could join us today to hear three of our faculty members give their expert analysis of the upcoming election. Today, our presenters will present perspectives on the 2020 US presidential election and federal elections, which, of course, as you know, are 2 weeks away. Less than 2 weeks away. They will cover a range of topics from race and voting behavior to the American federal system during these fraught times. I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers now. Our first speaker will be Vincent Hutchings, and he is a research professor in the Center for Political Studies and the Haynes Walton Jr. Collegiate Professor in LS&A. He's also the Diversity and Social Transformation Professor, and he has appointments in the Departments of Political Science and Afro-American and African Studies. Professor Hutchings' general interests include public opinion, elections, voting behavior, and African-American politics. He is also interested in the ways that campaign communications can prime various group identities and subsequently affect candidate evaluations. Our second speaker will be Angela Ocampo. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and also a faculty associate in the Center for Political Studies. Her research examines the political incorporation of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, both as everyday participants and as political leaders within American institutions. Her current book project investigates the concept of perceived belonging to U.S. society and its influence on political interest and political engagement among Latinos. Our third speaker is Jenna Bednar. She's a professor of political science and public policy at the University of Michigan and also a research professor in the Center for Political Studies. She's a member of the external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute, and she's the Edie N. Goldenberg Endowed Director of Michigan and Washington. Her research focuses on how collective action builds social goods and the role that government plays in that collaboration. Current work includes robust system design, especially of federalism, states as innovators in federal systems, and then out-of-district campaign contributions, how culture affects the way people respond to laws and norms, transboundary water systems governance, and governance to support human flourishing. Each presenter will speak for approximately 10 or 15 minutes, and then after all the speakers have had their chance, we will follow with the Q&A. I invite you to send in any questions you have through the comments section on YouTube. You can send your questions in throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can before our time ends. Note that live captioning of this event is available. Thank you again for joining us today, and thanks to our presenters, and I hope you enjoy the presentations. I will now turn things over to our speakers. Vince?
Thanks, Ken. I hope everyone can hear me here. I am going to, let's see, is my screen shared already? I guess it's already shared, okay. Can everyone see the full picture here? I'm gonna assume that that's a yes, since I haven't heard any indication otherwise. So I'm gonna start here. I've only got about 8 or 9 slides here. And what I want to do, as you can see from the title, is to focus on the different shifts that I've noticed in the demographic support for the different candidates in the election. That's what's most noteworthy to me. And I guess I'll start here with this slide. Now, the numbers here may be too small for you, depending on how you've got your screen configured. But don't worry, I'm going to walk you through this, and I'll keep coming back to this particular figure in terms of describing the relevant numbers as I move forward. My comments are going to focus on the, this is, by the way, results from a New York Times poll that came out. It's based on a survey that was done, I believe, between October 15th and October 18th. So it's relatively recent. It's one poll, admittedly, but it is, in many respects, in keeping with all the other public polls that I have seen up to now. And I'm going to focus on how the state of the race is at the moment relative to the last couple of elections with respect to differences in the context of gender, in the context of age, and in the context of race. What the theme will be that I'll keep coming back to is that Biden is doing better among these populations in many cases than is usually the case for a Democratic candidate. And Trump is doing worse than he did in 2016 and worse than Romney did in 2012. So again, take a good look at this to the extent that you can, but I'll be referencing this information moving forward. The relevant point is that, well, things don't look good at the moment, at least for Donald Trump, but it is possible, and it is still certainly not unprecedented that he may be able to turn it around. Okay, so I mentioned gender is one of the areas I want to start with, and so what I'm going to do is simply reference, there's nothing fairly sophisticated here. I'm going to reference exit poll data from the 2012 and 2016 context, first among women and then later among men. I imagine that our audience is not unfamiliar with the fact that women have traditionally been a Democratic constituency in voting for Democratic presidential candidates and at other levels of office since 1980. And you can get a sense about what those numbers are, obviously, from what you see here on screen. But based on that New York Times poll that I showed you on the first slide, Biden is doing much better among women, or at least as well, and probably better than these numbers here. Again, the New York Times poll is just one poll, but nevertheless, that poll had him at 58% among women, which would be better both than Clinton, who was, of course, the first female candidate of a major party ticket, and even Barack Obama in 2012. So that's one point. The other point is that Trump, as a Republican, is doing even worse than Republicans traditionally do with this constituency writ large, which is to say it's usually in the 40 percentile range. The New York Times poll had him at 35%. In short, there is the potential that the gender gap could be as large here as it has been in decades, maybe even ever. With respect to men, not surprisingly, I imagine for most of you who are in attendance here, you'll learn that men tend to be a constituency that is nominally in favor of the Republican Party. That's true for the last couple of election cycles, and it's been true actually for some time, at least since 1980. And in this respect as well, Biden is doing actually about, he's in the New York Times poll, he's polling at 42%. That's in the range of what Clinton did and a little worse than what Obama did in 2012. But what's interesting is that Trump is only polling at about 48% for men, at least in the New York Times poll. And that's he's doing a little worse than we would expect. So Biden's doing about what you would expect for a Democrat. Trump is doing worse, even among men. Now, if I can just shift to age here, or age groups, I'm going to talk first about the young and then about the old. This is a constituency that in the last few election cycles has started to lean towards the Democratic Party pretty heavily. Part of this, some of you may know, is because of the racial demographic of younger voters. They are increasingly people of color for a variety of reasons, which I can maybe discuss in Q&A if you're interested. So part of what's being driven here is the fact that this population is disproportionately composed of people of color. But even granting that, this is a Democratic constituency for the most part, and Biden is doing about as well as we would expect. In the New York Times poll, he's polling at 58%, a little better than Clinton, not quite as well as Obama, but about where you'd expect. But the noteworthy point for me is that Republicans, both Trump in 2016 and Romney in 2012, are usually north of 35% for this group. But for Donald Trump, the New York Times poll has him at 30% for this group. So that's not good. Biden doing about where you'd expect, Trump doing worse than usual for this population. With respect, for older voters, in some ways the news is even more grim. And that's because, of course, these voters turn out to vote at a much higher rate than younger voters. Now, this is a population that trends historically Republican over the last several cycles, election cycles. That's in part because just as younger voters tend to be disproportionately non-white, older voters, particularly over 65, are disproportionately white. And that's a constituency that leans towards the Republican Party. And this population is, again, just nominally, not overwhelmingly perhaps, but nominally a Republican constituency. You would expect something north of 50%, probably in a range of 54, 55%. However, based on the most recent, this New York Times poll that I referenced on the first slide, Trump is polling at 41%. So that is significantly lower than we would expect for a Republican nominee. So that is troubling from the vantage point of the Republican ticket. For what it's worth, Biden is, for the most part, at 51%, overperforming so far among this demographic. If that holds, and particularly in states like Florida and some other states that have populations that are over 65, a higher fraction of them, that would spell bad news for the Republican ticket as well. And finally, I want to say a few words about race. The New York Times poll, if you had a chance to look at it, you'll note that they simply collapsed groups across the different minority populations because they didn't have enough for any specific group. I'll get to that in the next slide, but I'll address that by looking at a different poll, a poll that came out from Pew. But for now, I just want to talk about exit poll data over the last few election cycles. Again, this shouldn't be terribly surprising to anyone who's been paying attention. Whites are, of course, a Republican constituency and have been really since 1968, where from that election on, the Republican Party has won either the majority or the plurality of the white vote at the presidential level, usually in the range of about 55%, sometimes a little higher, especially during the Reagan years. The New York Times poll, however, has Trump only at 50%. He's still winning that population, 44 for Biden, 50 for Trump, but that's lower than he should be doing. So if Trump is losing among older voters relative to where he should be, and he's not performing where he should be for his party with respect to white voters, that is another indicator of trouble. And I think this may be the last set of slides before I have a concluding slide. This Pew poll came out a while ago, and the reason I wanted to show this is because it breaks down minority groups more specifically as opposed to just talking about non-whites. It's a little older, and the numbers aren't exactly the same as the New York Times poll, but it's a similar distribution. Again, Trump is doing about he is winning barely this population, but it shouldn't be this close. Biden is doing about as well as you expect, and maybe even a little better. Certainly better than Clinton did, if these numbers are reflective in the final results. African Americans look like you would expect them to look. It's a population that's voted overwhelmingly for the Democrats since the 1960s. I think there will be more to be said by other panelists about the Latino vote, but I'll just say that that's a population that's overwhelmingly Democratic as well. So this gives you some sense about how things are lining up at the moment. And this is probably not the profile that one would look for as a Republican in order to make gains. You would want to cut into the Latino and Asian American populations, and to some degree African American populations, if you wanted to eke out a victory. So, in conclusion, I've glossed over this point, but it is worth highlighting nevertheless, because although there's a lot of focus on the different groups in the electorate and where they are leaning one candidate versus another, what's not often discussed is the fact that the foundation of the modern Republican Party is the non-Hispanic white vote, and that population has been declining as a share of the electorate over the last several election cycles. It's hard to wrap our heads around, but as recently, relatively speaking, as the 1980s, whites represented, non-Hispanic whites represented over 85%, approaching 90% of the electorate. that number has dropped in each of the elections moving forward. And in 2016, it was just 71%. It's not clear what it'll be in 2020, but it could be 70 or even below 70% of the electorate. Much of the gain is coming, again, from the Hispanic share of the electorate, which is likely to grow even higher by 2020, probably in the 12 to 13 percentile range. And this just gives you a sense about how this population has grown. It used to be negligible, and now it's definitely going to be in the double digits and probably larger even than the African American share of the vote, which is usually about 12%. Blacks are, for the most part, holding steady. The Asian population is growing as well. So the main takeaway of my comments this afternoon are about the shifting demographics and about the declining share of the Republican base in the electorate. All these things don't guarantee a Biden victory, but they certainly make it harder for Republicans to succeed. And I think I'll conclude on that point.
Okay. Thanks, Vince. That was great. Angela, you're up.
There we go. So can you all see my screen? Perfect. All right, so thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about the minority vote in 2020 and provide some evidence from the Latino community, which really segues really nicely from what Vince was just talking about. The thing that I want to begin with is to talk a little bit about sort of having this historical perspective on presidential vote choice from the 60s forward, but really breaking it down by racial and ethnic group. So from this graph, from using the ANEA's data, it is really evident that white voters show a slight and fairly consistent preference towards Republican candidates in presidential elections for over the last 60 years, while Black voters have solidly supported Democratic contenders, and Latinos also have historically been more likely to support Democrats than Republicans, although their support has not been as consistent as that of Black voters. What's also important here is to really think about how there is not just a racial gap in terms of presidential vote choice, but this is also amplified in many ways by gender. And so it is the case that consistently women of color are much more supportive of Democratic candidates than are white women. And, a majority of white women, with a few exceptions, are supportive of Republican candidates in presidential election, whereas women of color are consistently and really overwhelmingly supportive of Democratic candidate, with support upwards of about 75% of women of color preferring the Democrat. And so it's important to really keep in mind these presidential vote choice preferences by race and gender, because I think we ought to really think about how all of this has been happening in sort of the backdrop of also a changing and diversifying electorate. So as Vince was talking about, our electorate has been changing, and it's been changing quite substantially. We know that the non-white eligible voter population has accounted for more than 3/4 of the total U.S. electorate growth since 2000. And so between 2000 and 2018, voters who are Latino, Black, and Asian, or other racial or ethnic group that's not white, have accounted for 76% of this growth in the electorate. What's important here, and what I really want to underscore, is that Latino eligible voters contributed the most to the growth in the electorate. And so Latinos alone accounted for 39% of the overall increase in our country's eligible voting population. The growth in the electorate of Latinos primarily is coming from those who are US born, who are coming of age. That is, that they're already eligible voters and don't necessarily have to overcome hurdles like naturalizing in order to be eligible to vote. So the 12.4 million Latinos who turned 18 between 2000 and 2018 accounted for 80% of that growth in the Latino eligible voter population. And I do want to kind of emphasize this point here that was also alluded to earlier, that Latino sustained growth over the past 2 decades is going to make them the projected largest minority group among U.S. eligible voters in 2020 for the first time in a presidential election. And so thinking about what this looks like across geography and states, it's really important because we know that some states play a critical role in the Electoral College and the eventual outcome of the election. But we know that the share of non-Hispanic white eligible voters has declined in all 50 states. So this trend is not necessarily new, but it is really playing out to varying degrees across the country, with some states experiencing particularly significant shifts in their composition. So 5 states have observed the largest growth of Latino shares in their electorate. These include places like California, where we know that there's a substantial population of Latinos, but also another important and critical states like Nevada, Florida, Arizona, and Texas. So again, we know that states like Florida have been pivotal to every U.S. presidential victory in the last 20 years. And there, the white share of the electorate has fallen 13 percentage points since 2000. At the same time, the Latino share of the electorate has gone up 9 percentage points. We are also seeing that Arizona is now largely being seen as an emerging battleground state, and this can be attributed to substantial changes that the racial and ethnic composition of the electorate has had, particularly coming from Latinos. So as we head into 2020, I want us to revisit 2016 a little bit to really think about what exactly happened and what happened with the Latino vote. So soon after the election, many places, many news outlets and other research entities like Pew were surprised at how high the Latino vote had been for Trump, given his particular anti-immigrant rhetoric during the campaign trail. So using data from exit polls, many news outlets and Pew estimated that the Latino vote for Trump had been in the high 20s, close to 30%, and that Clinton had received barely around a high of 65%, and that this was in contrast to what Obama had received, much lower. And so the debate continued with other folks like those from Latino Decisions, which is a research firm that primarily surveys the Latino population. And they argued that this was actually upwards above 70% support for Clinton, and that it was actually much closer to what Obama had received. Very different thinking and sort of argument that was being made from what we were drawing from the national exit polls. And so to really assess kind of what happened, my co-authors and I decided to get precinct level returns for 2016 to better be able to estimate what the share of the support from Latino community went for Clinton and then what share went for Trump. So here, these are just some graphs that show broken down by state. Every single dot that you see in the graphs is a precinct for within each one of these particular states. And then you see in the x-axis the share of the population that was Latino for these particular precincts. So using this data, we do some analysis based on ecological inference and the R by C method, where we assess the proportion of support for both candidates from Latinos using these precinct totals and, again, precinct level demographics. So what we actually find is that support for Trump and for support for Clinton was actually higher than had been reported by the national exit polls. And we find that it actually been closer and even sort of higher of potentially 75% for Clinton. And so sort of thinking about what this means and sort of thinking about how consequential the Latino vote, I sort of really want to caution people to jump to quick conclusions about the 2020 support of for Trump and for Joe Biden among Latinos using only exit poll data. Okay, so now thinking about the Latino vote in 2018 and sort of how 2018 can give us a window as to what might happen in 2020 with this particularly important and consequential voting bloc. So we know that in the 2018 midterm cycle, national voter turnout in the elections was historic, and it was nationwide. There was around an 11-point increase in turnout. However, when we do a closer examination of this historic turnout, an increase in turnout, it reveals that racial and ethnic minorities drove large parts of this increase. And for Latinos specifically, voter turnout increased around 13 percentage points, which is about a 15% increase in Latino turnout, according to US estimates. And what you see here is some analysis that I've done for particularly important states in sort of different parts of the country, and we see that consistently, right? This trend of increased turnout of Latinos, it's actually higher than compared to all other racial and ethnic groups. So their turnout was actually much higher, even when compared to the baseline of 2014 turnout. So what do Latinos care about, right? And what are some of the important issues that Latino voters are thinking about, given how consequential they might be in this upcoming election? So what I want to underscore here is that although immigration gets talked about as one of the potentially only issues that Latinos care about, that's not necessarily the case. So here, using data from the most recent survey of the NALEO weekly tracking election poll, which was just published yesterday, we can see that the most important issue for the Latino community, as it is for other Americans, is also handling the handling of COVID. Latino voters also really care about wages and jobs. And this really comes to no surprise, given how consequential this pandemic has been and how detrimental it has been for their community. But we also see that healthcare is important, and issues of discrimination are important. And yes, immigration is and does matter, but is not the only issue that the community cares about. Looking really quickly at what these candidate preferences are, and so we see here sort of broken down by different states. We see that it is certainly the case that Biden has a lead with Latinos nationwide, but there are important differences by state. And in particular, the lead that Biden has over Trump really narrows in states like Florida. And I'll be happy to talk more about sort of what this means, this narrowing lead in Florida, for the potential outcome of the election. Okay, so I think, the point that I really want to make here is how impactful and consequential the Latino electorate is and can be in upcoming elections. So this year, we're going to see a record number of over 32 million Latinos that are going to be eligible to vote. And, this is up from 27.3 million that were eligible to vote in 2016. And as I mentioned earlier, the 2020 election is going to mark the first time that Latinos are going to be the largest racial and ethnic minority group in the electorate, accounting for just over 13% of all eligible voters. So I think we really ought to think about how these demographic trends indicate that minority voters, and in particular, Latino voters, are going to be influential in elections in the foreseeable future. And so really, what I think and what's important, what I want you all to walk away with as well, is that the real story is not only just how much the Latino vote has grown and how important it is, but it's going to be a story about whether or not Biden is really going to be able to mobilize this community, and what this turnout is going to look like, especially in key swing states and also toss-up districts. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Angela. That was really interesting. Okay, Jenna, you're next.
Thank you, Ken. That was super interesting. It's one of these things where you get caught up watching what your colleagues are presenting, and then you look, what? How exciting! Now I get to talk. I am not going to talk about voting forecasts for the presidential election. Instead, I want to take you in a different direction. Let me set this up so I am So you can see a slightly bigger version of my screen. So what I want to get you thinking about with this upcoming presidential election is, even if all you care about is the outcome of the presidential election, because we're so focused on it, that you should also pay attention to the states and pay attention to down ballot races and down ballot issues if you're voting in Michigan or another state where there might be ballot measures on the ballot. So why is that? Well, when we think about the electoral process, what is it? We as voters or as agents, we have these preferences, and we have an idea about what we might want to do on our ballot. We vote, and then according to some function, we count those votes, and then voila, we get government, and from government we get policy. So this is the way we think about the electoral process. But this process is a function entirely, almost entirely, of the states. Why is that? It's straight from the Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. That second clause notwithstanding, the times, places, and manner of running our elections have been left to the states almost entirely, with very little federal intervention. And so what is it that the states have responsibility for? Well, how can they affect our election? Well, they set qualifications for voters with registration, ID, polling hours, whether you can vote by mail, etc. Qualifications for candidates, such as term limitations, which we have in Michigan, for our state legislature, drawing the boundaries and redistricting. They structure the electoral experience with ballot design and also with how parties nominate candidates to the ballot. And of course, everybody's favorite institution, the Electoral College, is an instantiation of state preferences over popular preferences for electing the president. They also tremendous diversity in campaign finance laws. So states literally shape the way we vote and therefore the outcomes that we get. So I want to take a little bit of time today just to walk through a couple of the ways that states are shaping the way we vote, because I want to motivate you to pay a lot of attention to the state section of your ticket. All right. And so we'll start with ballot design, taking us back to another presidential election, okay? Ballot design and the butterfly effect. So I am a scholar at the Santa Fe Institute. We work on chaos theory and complexity. So chaos theory, the butterfly effect, is the sensitive dependence on initial conditions in which a small change can result in a large difference in a later state. Okay, the butterfly effect. Well, let's think about the 2000 presidential election, where Gore won by a whisker, the popular vote, right? But of course, that's not how you get elected. You get elected through the Electoral College, and Bush took the Electoral College. Everybody's eyes on election day and night, and the next day and next night, and the weeks after that were on Florida. So again, keeping in mind that we may, and actually definitely will, need to wait at least a few days to know who the victor is at the presidential race this year. In 2000, if you all remember, we were waiting a while. And we were waiting because Florida's vote was super close, with 550 votes apart. But those weren't the only two people on the ticket. We also had Ralph Nader pulling the Green voters toward him, and Pat Buchanan, a conservative candidate, pulling some of the people who might have voted most likely for Bush in his direction. And so this is, fun, actually, as a political scientist, to think about multiple candidates getting significant numbers of votes, but it affected the outcome. So let's look at the vote for Buchanan that year, right? And in different counties in Florida, if you look at this graphic, you see there are a few counties that really stand out. And one that stands out in particular, Palm Beach County, right? So when we as social scientists, we see data like this and we think, my goodness, what's happening in Palm Beach County, right? Why is it that suddenly Palm Beach County showed so much affection for Pat Buchanan in this election? And pretty quickly, people recognized that people in Palm Beach County had an unusual voting experience. They had a ballot design that was the butterfly ballot, where the ballot is like the wings of the butterfly open up, and then you express your preference by punching a hole in the spine of the butterfly, if you will, right? And so you look at this, and here you are staring at my screen, and depending on how large this is on whatever you're looking at, you can make out on the left side, we've got the Republican candidate first, then the Democratic candidate, then Libertarian, then Green, et cetera. We go down. Over on the right, it's Reform and Socialist, and but if you're looking at this and think about yourself and the way you are when you vote, and how you take in the options available to you. So really you're there, most people are there because they're interested in expressing a preference between the Republican candidates and the Democratic candidate. So you look at this and you see, Republican, the 3, I don't know why they started numbering it at 3, and the little arrow going over, and you punch that button if you want to vote to support the Bush-Cheney ticket. And then so the second one, labeled number 5, again, you're like, okay, numbers don't seem to correspond in any sense to how I should vote here, is how you would express a preference for Gore Lieberman, or at least that's a reasonable interpretation of what's happening here. Especially since you don't have the luxury of looking at this in the same way that you're looking at it on your screen right now. Instead, you're looking at it as you're stuffed into this tiny tin can of a voting box. And although it's hard for you to bend down and read those instructions, you can see in large red letters, there's a legal time limit for voting of 5 minutes. So you are a good law-abiding citizen. You want to obey the rules. You don't want to take up too much time. You want to get in and get out, and you vote. And you are a human, and you might make a mistake, right? So the ballot design, can shape the way we as humans interact and express our preferences, and can cause us to make mistakes. Nobody intended for anybody to make a mistake here, but it's quite possible. And if we go back and look at the analysis, one thing we say is, well, gee, is this unusual number of voters in Palm Beach County, is there some explanation for this? And so some of our colleagues put this together, looking at, well, it should in some sense correspond to the number of conservative voters in the county altogether. So it should have a relationship to the number of votes for Bush. And that's what we see here. Along the x-axis is the number of votes for Bush. Each dot is a county. And then the y-axis is the votes for Buchanan within that same county. So you plot them that way. And we see this lovely relationship until we get to Palm Beach County, which is just completely off the charts. So it's very hard to explain Palm Beach County's expression that in that 2000 election without ignoring the ballot experience. So even at that level of designing the interface, it matters what states, and in this case, the local jurisdictions, are doing. There is a temptation, of course, should we standardize ballot design and have one national template, say, I would push back against that and say that first, experimentation at the state level is good, and second, it would make it easier to hack, right? So those who are concerned, all of us are concerned with election security. The fact that we have such a decentralized system with so many different methods of expressing a vote can lead to ballot problems like we see here in this butterfly effect, which had an enormous outcome of flipping the election. But more often than not, those differences aren't going to have this huge effect and could save us from fraud. Okay, so some other things that happened here in Michigan in 2018, we had a ballot measure which passed Proposal 8, Prop 3, to change some of the other ways that we vote in the state of Michigan. Some of the key ones that many of us who are voting in Michigan are enjoying right now is being able to obtain an absent voter ballot without providing a reason. It used to be that you had to say why you couldn't show up on election day. And simultaneous registration. So really relaxing the registration requirements. Prior to that, it was 30-day advance registration. So we as faculty used to always say to our students, end of September, if you want to participate, you really have to get on the ball now so you can register to vote, so you can be allowed to participate in November. In terms of same-day registration, what effect does that have? Some people say, well, this is quite partisan and would benefit the Democrats, but the primary effect seems to be boosting turnout. You make it easier to vote and people can vote. In terms of a partisan balance, studies have shown either no change in turnout or that it favors Republican voters. There was just released a study about voting in America, ranking by states. This is from Northern Illinois University, looking at a bunch of criteria for how easy it is to vote. The criteria on the right side here, combining registration and the voting experience. And so you can see the lighter colored states are where it's more difficult to vote. And the deeper green colored states are where the voting is easiest to do. And I'm quite pleased to be able to show you this, which is in the state of Michigan, we had significant upward movement. We were ranked 45th in 2016 and now are ranked 13th, and thanks to, in large part, to Prop 3. So it is, and the very hard work of our Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, to try to make it as easy as possible for everyone to vote. And she just tweeted this out actually right before we started today, saying that as of today, Michigan hits an all-time record number of registered voters. Something that's interesting to us to think about, though, is given that so many people in this pandemic year are going to be voting by mail, we're going to have to wait to find out the outcomes. And this graphic put together by the New York Times is just spectacular in the kind of information that it conveys to us. So some key dates for us as we're thinking about how quickly states will be able, or election officials will be able to process the votes that are cast by mail is first, when can they start opening up the envelopes, the outer envelopes, verifying that it is a registered voter and that this voter has not previously voted, because they would want to cast out any duplicate ballots. That's just processing, the pre-processing of the ballot. So when can you start that? Then when can they start feeding it into the machines, the tabulation, right? Because this is all labor, right? So feeding it into the machines. And then how long can votes that are ballots that have been mailed in, how long can you wait and keep collecting those ballots, even if they arrive after election day, maybe because there was, they're postmarked in advance, but there was some mail delay. So that's what's captured here in this graphic. And you'll notice that some states, so Georgia and Minnesota, they can start opening up those envelopes as soon as they arrive, right? Just getting it all ready. There are some states, Nevada and Arizona, that can even start feeding it into the machines really early. So we should be thinking about these states as being more likely to be able to report out election results on election day. It's election season, I like to think of it now, not just election day, but on election day on November 3rd, Arizona and Nevada, we might have more faith in the results that they're reporting out because they will have been able to process and tabulate those ballots. Look at us in Michigan, though. In Michigan and Wisconsin, the tightest of all of these states. So we can start opening those envelopes a day before, and we can't feed them into the machine until the day of. We had a really interesting conversation here at the University of Michigan. Maybe some of you were able to tune into it, where I interviewed Jocelyn Benson and then Frank LaRose, who is the Ohio Secretary of State. He was quite pleased at how much time he has to open and get those ballots prepared, and his ability to wait and receive ballots. Constrained by laws that are set at the state level. Again, paying attention to your state legislature. The last thing I want to talk about is redistricting, and this again is because of some changes here at the Michigan level. So one thing I like to a riddle I like to pose to my students is, in 1 year, Michigan's congressional delegation went from a 9-7 Democratic majority to 9-6 Republican majority. Incumbents won all but 2 races, and the proportion of Democratic to Republican voters did not decline. How is this possible? And those of you who are political junkies can recognize the shifts in the number of delegates that we have to Congress, corresponding to changes in the census. But of course, the answer to this is redistricting. And as we've lost population, we have lost in reapportionment, lost seats. Now, when you lose a seat, you need to redraw the district lines. And over this period, Republicans have been much better at gerrymandering, much better, leading to dominance in the state legislatures. But they're better at it because long ago they recognized the value of state governments. Democrats still are quite late to the game in recognizing the significance of state legislatures. I always like to ask my students, should we blame any state legislature for doing a partisan gerrymandering? And because I would say no, we elect these officials to represent our interests, and if those are attached to a party, then we should reward them for creating a districting system that favors the party. That's incredibly controversial. I'm not saying that it's a good thing. I'm just saying I don't think we can blame a partisan process for having a partisan outcome. And so, of course, there are some alternatives, and this is where I'm going to close out, just thinking about what we're doing here in the state of Michigan. Again, back to our 2018 ballot measures, this one is Prop 2, establishing the Independent Districting Commission. And so the way it works is a commission of 13 registered voters, which has just been assembled in the last couple of months. And I think they met for the first time last month. So it's 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 5 voters who didn't express a partisan preference. They are the ones tasked with setting up our new districts. And an earlier time when Jocelyn Benson was on campus, I asked her about this. This is right after Prop 2 passed. And this is what she said. Yippee. She was so delighted that she said coming into office with this charge, she couldn't wait to have that happen. So we should watch for what happens after the next census and with the next redistricting plans starting in 2021. So I think I'll close with this, which is, if all you care about is what's happening between Trump and Biden, then still you should care about what's happening in the states, because the states are the ones who are shaping that whole process. And so they're very, very much shaping the outcomes. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenna. Thanks to all the panelists. That was great. I have a number of questions, many good questions. So I think all your mics are open, so feel free to make it conversational. We have a debate tonight for the presidential candidates. Just don't shout over each other, though, because this is we've seen too much of this. Okay, so I'll start with one that I think a lot of people might wonder. Is there research describing the characteristics of likely voters who are still undecided at this late date?
I'll take a quick stab at that. So as this won't be terribly surprising. The people who are most invested in the contest and who wins are going to be most inclined, obviously, to choose a preferred candidate and ultimately to vote. And these would be strong partisans or individuals who express a stronger or higher level of identification with one of the two parties. So consequently, the undecideds are going to be people who either have weaker partisanship or who are conflicted in some respect, meaning that their party identification conflicts with some salient social identity. For example, if they are evangelicals and also Democrats, because evangelicals tend to be aligned with the Republican Party, but if they nevertheless identify with the Democratic Party, they would be conflicted, and as a consequence, they would be more inclined to be undecided.
Anybody else? Okay. Sorry, there was so many good ones. What indications do we have about turnout for these groups coming into the 2020 election? Angela?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I guess to read a little bit of what Jenna said earlier, it is election season, and we are seeing that the election has already been underway in many places. I think that if anything that we can take away from 2018 is that turnout is, and even thinking, right, it is an off year, but we can expect turnout to be potentially high for certain groups, like I mentioned, I think for Latinos. So that is sort of one expectation, but we won't really know, right, until sort of what happens. I think what's really interesting, and I think to think about, is the extent to which mailing voting could be influential and could actually, and because a lot of the restrictions have been eased in many states, right, people could potentially access the ballot that way, and we could see increasing turnout. At the same time, right, I think we ought to really think about ways in which it hasn't been that easy to vote, right? So places where there's very few drop-off boxes, right? If we think of places like Texas, right, where there's one per county. So what does that mean, and how does that actually affect turnout? So I think those are all sort of different variables that sort of go into the equation of thinking about what could influence turnout for these different groups across race.
Anybody else? Vince? How much can we trust the polls this time around, and why? How is polling different in 2020 than in previous election cycles?
Well, a lot of pollsters had some egg on their face because of the 2016 outcome. Obviously, it's worth reminding everyone that at the national level, the polls were pretty accurate. I think they suggested a 3.3 percentage point victory for Clinton, and it turned out to be about 2 points or so. So that was pretty good. But as Jenna has reminded us, it is the Electoral College that determines the victor and not the popular vote. And it was a number of state polls that were off. Wisconsin, for example, I think was off by like 6 percentage points, which is pretty big. I'll be brief here in an effort to allow the other panelists to join in. But one of the big factors that was problematic was the undercounting of non-college educated whites, who tend to be a constituency that leans towards the Republican Party. And it's also a constituency that is, for a variety of reasons, less inclined to participate in surveys. And so they were, in short, undercounted. And this undercounted the level of support for Donald Trump in the 2016 contest. Pollsters are aware of that mistake. They have tried to correct it in a variety of different ways. It doesn't necessarily completely take it off the board, but it seems unlikely that they will be making that same mistake because they are aware of it now in a way that they were not in 2016. They've tried to calibrate accordingly, and mostly by weighting up, to use the parlance of the discipline, applying more emphasis to the results that they get from non-college educated whites, so that they don't undercount that population. So for all those reasons, it seems as if the mistakes that were made in 2016 are less likely to be made in 2020. We may make, of course, new mistakes in 2020, but it seems unlikely that the particular problems that unfolded 4 years ago are going to unfold in 2020.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
of either one of my two colleagues here who work in voting behavior and work much more with polling data than I do. So when we go to a site like 538, right, and 538 as an aggregator of many different polls, and 538 gives a rating, a familiar one to us, A's and B's and C's and D's to the different polls. Is a reason why a poll would get an A versus a D part of what you've just said, Vince, in the sense that they are reweighting voters, or overweighting populations that they've missed in the past and that sort of thing? Is that part of what contributes to that rating?
The short answer is yes. There are multiple ways, Jenna, that surveys can be conducted. In the old days, there was a straightforward representative sample survey, scientific sample survey, and that still is the industry standard. But increasingly now, for cost reasons and for feasibility reasons, we rely on what are known as opt-in internet polls, which are cheaper to run and can be relatively accurate as well. But they don't rely on scientific sampling procedures in quite the same way. So from the vantage point of the purists, and I guess I'm in that camp, we would place less importance on polls that are not derived from strict representative sampling, utilizing strict representative sampling procedures. But again, that's not to say we would throw out those other polls, just that they would perhaps be seen as less credible, but not incredible. And that's just one of many different criteria. So polls have different levels of quality, some of which we've just discussed. And Angela may have a different take on this too.
Yeah, no. So I mean, I think that that's right on point, Vincent. Thinking about the way that the polls are sort of rated. I don't know the exact, so all of the things that go into the New York Times rating, but it is the case that they will rate certain polls lower that they believe that are not as nationally representative as others. Or oftentimes they'll look at maybe even the margin of error, right, and sort of try to assess maybe how reliable this poll might be given that margin of error, in addition to many other things.
Okay. So I have a question that is more specific. I want to generalize it. It's about COVID-19. And about the possibility that it will affect turnout, the possibility that there won't be enough poll workers, and is early voting resolving this problem? What's the evidence that any of you have?
I could start and just convey what Secretaries LaRose and Benson brought up 2 weeks ago, because I asked them that very question, right? Because it's on all of our minds. And that's a complex of questions. That's a set of questions. So I asked them first, are you ready? Are you ready for election day? And so they both said, we're going to have plenty of poll workers. I think Secretary LaRose said they already have something like 50,000 poll workers, as many as they need. It sounded like here in Michigan, we might need a few more, but we're on track to having everybody that we need. And that they will have PPE, they'll be fully protected. So you as a voter, the voting experience, you should feel like it's going to be as hygienic as possible with distancing protocols and that sort of thing. But at the same time, of course, many people are opting to vote by mail. And so having that option, it was just sort of perfect timing on our part in the state of Michigan and in many other states to make it much more accessible to vote by mail, because that is, it couldn't be safer. So I can't remember, that hit all of the questions that were buried within that.
Yeah, I think so. I think everybody wants to know if turnout will be lower this year because of COVID. I mean, I think that's a big, even given mail-in voting, but that's that. But anyway, others want to address any of these questions?
I think just to reiterate sort of this point that Jenna made, right? It is, the states and different states have been taking different approaches to this, but we have been seeing from the secretaries of state and sort of different election officials at the state level that they have been making different and big efforts to try to increase the number of poll workers, right? So even in places like Ohio, which has registered, has received, has gotten a record number of election workers, they are opening a call for even more, right? So they're sort of even preparing for a lot more than what they think is going to happen on election day. So different states, again, are preparing in different ways. And I think sort of in thinking about what's going to happen with the mail-in voting, and so I think that people are trying to find ways to vote in however they feel the most comfortable, right? And so we're going to see that maybe in some places, maybe in states where COVID has hit a lot more and has been hitting a lot harder, maybe people are going to be more comfortable voting by mail than in person. And so I think we might see sort of differences by state and sort of that in some ways interacted with how COVID has hit particular regions and how that will affect turnout.
Okay. So Jenna, your talk had to do with a little bit with third-party candidates, and one implication was taking votes from Democrats or Republicans. Has it been thought that maybe those third-party voters would just not have voted at all if they didn't have the third option?
Yeah, it's interesting to think of. I probably did say something along the lines of taking votes away, which is bad on me. I shouldn't have used those words. It's great, I think, when people vote with their heart for a candidate that they know doesn't have a chance of winning. And I will say one of the innovations that we're really watching at the state level is the introduction of a different electoral process, a different method of aggregating the votes. Remember, that was one of the things that I said states have control over. And that method is ranked choice voting. And an interesting thing about ranked choice voting, so with ranked choice voting, for the anyone who might not be as familiar with it, rather than picking a single candidate and expressing a preference over a single candidate out of the list, the long list that you get, you can say, I like this one best, and this one's second best, and this one third best, and you can rank as many as you want, right? And then when all the votes are tallied, the lowest the candidate that got the fewest number of number one rankings is dropped. And if you happen to rank this person number one, like it was Buchanan, in that Florida case, he would have been the lowest vote getter. Then say your second preference was for Bush, then your vote would count for Bush. So that gives voters this opportunity to say, okay, they can vote with their hearts. They can say, this is what I would really like in an ideal world. but I know I'm not always going to get my ideal. And so here's my second choice. People are very excited about this. There's going to be much more opportunity for us to express information about what we want. And I think for those who are elected, a much better sense of what their constituents want. So I'm excited about ranked choice voting. It exists in Maine right now. It's on the ballot in Massachusetts and Alaska for this in November, and we'll see if it diffuses further.
Okay, the next these are two questions that I think are mostly for Angela, but the first is about historically lower voting participation rates among Latinos than other populations, and whether that is a trend and whether that's continuing, like amongst even citizens Latinos. And can also you speak about heterogeneity among Latino voters, the differences across the states like Florida versus Texas, how this might impact the election?
Yeah, sure. So yes, so it is the case that Latino voters have lower turnout than other groups, and we've seen this trend sort of consistently over time, but sort of I kind of want to pause and say, but I think more recently, right? And so I sort of keep coming back to 2018 primarily because the changes in turnout were so large, and they were large across the board, and they were larger than for any other racial and ethnic group. So in some ways, Latino voters are now catching up, right, to the turnout rate of other racial and ethnic groups. And so I think, that kind of gives us an indication of like, yes, they do turn out lower, but given very recent changes that we've seen, they are catching up to turn out at very similar rates that of other racial and ethnic groups. And just to speak a little bit about heterogeneity among Latino voters, and I think sort of it's a really important point. And what I want to say is that even when we look at within states, there's a lot of heterogeneity, right? So when we think about Latinos in Florida, we should not only just think about Cuban voters, right? Because we've seen that there are a lot of Puerto Ricans that have been led the growth in the Latino population in Florida, and Puerto Ricans tend to be less conservative than Cubans. But even among Cuban voters, right, there are huge generational differences where older Cubans tend to be more conservative, and younger Cubans and those of younger generations are a lot more liberal, right? And so that's sort of some of the heterogeneity in the Latino population. Florida is a very diverse Latino community, and it's not just Cubans sort of dominating the Latino electorate there, right? I think we also have to think about Venezuelans and Colombians and, like, as I mentioned, Puerto Ricans. Whereas places like in Texas and California, it's a majority Mexican population, which sort of tends to have a different, obviously, experience in the U.S. And sort of, different. This might play out in different ways.
Anyone else on that?
I just had a follow up because I was curious. So I already knew that Latinos, and for what it's worth, Asian Americans, which is a bit ironic because Asian Americans on average, admittedly, it's a group that has a lot of heterogeneity, but on average, they have more income than any other racial or ethnic group. And income is usually associated with participation, but Asian Americans don't turn out on average as high as blacks and whites. But what I hadn't heard, and so I just learned something new here from listening to Angela, that in 2018, things changed, at least for the Latino population, pretty heavily in terms of turnout. Do you have any specifics, or could you speak more to that point? Why do you think 2018 was different?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. So that's a great question. Like, how did this happen? I do think part of it is, that many have been motivated by sort of Trump in many ways, right? And so Trump has brought in to the fold and has mobilized a lot of Latinos, has also brought a lot of Latinos to become naturalized citizens and then participate, right? So it's also the case that it's not just Latino citizens who participate at high rates. Actually, we have evidence that Latinos who naturalize, right, and especially when they become naturalized in really politically contentious moments like this one, they participate and they continue to participate habitually over time at very high rates. So we saw this in places like California in the 90s, where Latinos really mobilized against Prop 187 and Governor Pete Wilson, and Latinos who became mobilized at that time have shown consistent and really high rates of mobilization. So I think in some ways, sort of that's part of the answer why we're seeing this particular moment in 2018. And, what I think might happen for 2020, that we might see that translate into turnout for this election as well.
Jenna, did you have anything?
No, that was exactly what I was going to ask. So, yeah.
Well, I want to, people, Jenna, Vince and Angela probably know this better than I do, but my understanding is even in the African-American community, there was for many years, even after the protections that were given by the federal government in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, their turnout was lower on average than whites, for instance. But they've essentially caught up to whites in turnout. Am I right about that?
There's some contestation about that in the literature. So and Angela can speak to this too, I'm sure, but some traditional sources are in keeping with the story you just told. Bernard Fraga has a book that came out a couple years ago that suggests that because the traditional narrative says that with the Obama campaigns of 2008 and 2012, Black turnout not only met that of whites, but it exceeded it for the first time in American history. And that's a nice, happy story, but the Bernard Fraga book says that's not true. That better data indicates that whites still turn out at higher rates than do African Americans. There is an important caveat that I'll throw in there, and Angela may have a different take on this as well. Part of the explanation for at least the Black-white turnout gap, and there is such a gap, is economic, in that whites, of course, on average, have higher levels of education and income, and these are factors that are associated with participation. When you control for that, I do believe it is the case that the gap between Blacks and whites, it diminishes considerably, although whether it evaporates entirely is still up in the air.
Angela?
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. I think what's interesting there, and just to hone in on this point, is that it is true that when you control for socioeconomic factors, Black turnout, and the gap between Black and white turnout essentially diminishes, right? And I think what's really important about Bernard Fraga's book is sort of really a point about the sources that we use to even get our estimates for turnout and what this means, right? And so in the book, and I think there's other work that he has forthcoming where he looks at estimates using CPS compared to other estimates using voter file data to assess turnout, and how consistently there is a sort of a bias if even using CPS estimates for turnout, right? But he finds, right, in his book that one of the sort of most important predictors for high turnout among racial and ethnic communities is how big that population is within your local community and local district, right? So yes, we've identified important factors like socioeconomic status, but there seem to be these other really critical factors, and that being a critical mass within your particular geography or district, and that sort of addressing some of those gaps in turnout between whites and Blacks and Latinos or Asian Americans.
Okay. I say we'll take we'll probably end around 5:20 or 5:23 or something. How many state legislatures or state legislative houses could potentially flip partisan control in 2020? That was directed at you, Jenna.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. It's a great question. So flipping partisan control. Well, actually, let's think about states that have trifectas, right? Where both houses of the legislature and the governor are all from the same party. And there's some really good analysis that I saw on Ballotpedia, which is just a great source generally for polling election information and especially ballot measures. But I was looking at their analysis, and they're drawing from Cook Political Report polling data and analysis. And I think that the state that is seen to be most likely to lose its trifecta is Florida. And in some ways, this is, this really speaks to the conversation we were just having, right? Is that the changing electorate is changing outcomes in Florida. And so Florida looks highly vulnerable and likely to lose its Republican trifecta. A couple of other Republican trifecta states, if I'm remembering right, let's see, so Georgia is a possibility for losing its trifecta. Arizona is super interesting right now. And, but again, this really speaks to what we've been talking about with the changing composition of the electorate. There are a couple of Democratic trifectas that are also somewhat vulnerable. I think Colorado and Oregon are two that people are watching. But so.
Okay, this is a question that I'm sure you anticipate, but it's twice in the last 20 years the popular vote winner has lost because of the Electoral College. What actions could change the system, and should it be changed? This is a question we'll get at Thanksgiving too. So
should we change the Electoral College? Is that
or what other things should be changed if we think that's a problem?
Well, I'll go out on a limb here and say, yeah, it is a problem precisely because it diverges so remarkably from kind of at least straightforward, maybe even naive democratic norms. The Electoral College, I mean, the way the system has been set up, and it's obviously a legacy of what was done 200 plus years ago, did not envision, I suspect, the lopsided, imbalances in population across states. Jenna can speak to this, I suspect, as well, in the way that we have today. So California is obviously a massive state population-wise, but it gets the same number of senators. That has implications for the Electoral College as, Montana or North Dakota. This is not to disparage those states, but it is to say that democracy is ostensibly one person, one vote. But of course, in practice in the United States, particularly given the lopsided distribution of our population across states, it is far removed from one person, one vote. So I realize that a conversation about changing the Electoral College has, undeniable partisan implications. And so for that reason, it's going to be a difficult thing to push forward. But it's hard to justify on any kind of democratic small d grounds. Because why should the votes of people in North Dakota count for more than the votes of people in California, which they clearly and unmistakably do?
Not just more, but like 20 times more.
Yeah.
Three times.
3 times. All right.
Yeah. Yes. I love talking about the Electoral College.
All right. Well, okay.
You don't want to talk about it?
No. We'll have to do that offline. All right, Jenna, you had an answer to this, or you had a comment?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So the Electoral College, it's my own view, it's not going anywhere because constitutional amendment process is so hairy. It's so difficult to get across. Our objections to it, the objections that we hear most frequently about it are because it's flipping outcomes from Democratic wins to Republican wins, and so people argue that it's biased toward Republicans. I think the data on that are a little bit that argument is a little bit harder to support because you can talk about North Dakota and Wyoming and some other reliable Republican voting states, but if you're going to pull those out, you also have to talk about Washington, D.C. and Rhode Island and Vermont and some other small Democratic states. And if you're griping about California, then you also need to worry about voters in Texas, right? So, so the partisan lean, it's probably there, but it isn't as strong as the first part of Vince's response, which is that this is favoring states over the people. If you're going to talk about taking away this small state advantage, know that if you're going to have a constitutional amendment, it's got to pass those small states. So why are they going to give that up? I think it's going to lose on federalism grounds. But not to say that I wish that we could keep it. I've of mixed minds about that. But I just think that the reality is it's here.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So do you think, Jonathan, that maybe the promise is really with experimenting with winner take all, right? That it would be easier in some ways to achieve something like getting at outcomes with the sort of the popular vote versus sort of thinking about, like, we know a constitutional amendment may not actually happen, right? And so sort of the path of least resistance is going to go through, right, go states that are really pushing for winner take all and get more states on that.
Or to do like get away from the unit rule, is what you mean.
Well, I think maybe you're thinking about the national popular vote compact.
There's that.
Yeah.
All right, I'm not going to take up time today because I'm going to plug yet another amazing event that the University of Michigan is putting on pre-election, which is next week, Wednesday, maybe Tuesday. Anyway, but I'm going to be talking about the Electoral College. So Rob Mickey will be there talking about vote suppression, Edie Goldenberg talking about turnout. So it'll be a good time. You should come.
Okay, I'll ask two more questions, but I think our answers should be brief, okay? So the first question is about safety at the polls and the threats and so forth, Proud Boys and so forth, whether that is going to impact racial group turnout or minority racial group turnout. So Angela or anybody.
I could say what Jocelyn Benson said, because I asked her that as well.
What did she say?
Yeah, because I said, this is scary to people to imagine walking past people who are armed, and that is a form of vote suppression. And she reassured everybody that day that they were working on it. What they announced right after that was that because she said that she and Attorney General Nessel had been in conversation about this. So what they have done is first, for that 100 feet boundary surrounding any polling place where they do have jurisdiction, right? So you can't wear campaign materials as you enter there. You can't argue for your candidate inside that circle. They're banning weapons. So within there. And outside of it, they're going to be, if anybody's loitering with a weapon, they're going to move them along. And they're working with the state police on this for enforcement. Not that there will be armed officers present, but they will be on standby in case there's a problem, so they can be called in.
Angela or Vince, do you have any additions to add to that?
Well, I'm reassured to hear that. I think it's a fair question to ask, and I'm not as concerned about it. I know that there are certainly forces that would like to engage in this sort of behavior, but I also know that there are other forces out there who take a different view, meaning that for all the Proud Boys that you can identify, there will be other groups. I mean, after all, if folks are going to start bringing guns to ballot places, well, the Proud Boys aren't the only people who have guns.
Yeah. So just to add really quick, I mean, I think that a lot of the election officials have been trying to reassure voters, right? And so in trying to say, we're taking this seriously, we are preparing ourselves, that might reassure voters of color, or may not reassure some of them. But I think that for many of them, like, voting is really important, right? And so thinking about voting like your life depends on it, this hashtag has really taken off, right? And so I think that in many ways, while it might be a concern, it might not necessarily deter voters of color who really have a lot at stake in the election, not just in the presidential, but also like down ballot in a lot of these states. So I think that what Jenna said, like Vin said, is also reassuring. But I think that potentially it might be, but we don't necessarily know how it's gonna play out.
All right, and the last question I think we don't need to dwell on, but do candidates in their campaigns pay attention to academic research on elections like that coming out of ISR? I'll just answer it with one word. Yes, they do, but or that was 3 or something. But anyone else want to pipe in briefly on that?
Well, I think very briefly as well, many of the folks, certainly in many cases, the science that they use to run their campaigns is derived from places like ISR and CPS, and in some cases, individuals who are actually affiliated with these organizations or universities around the country work on behalf of these campaigns. So I know there's this notion that we're the ivory tower and that what we do has no impact on the quote unquote real world. But I actually reject that proposition. And all of us on this call probably know individuals who work not just in government, but also on campaigns. So yeah, they listen to us because we're the people who generate the ideas that drive at least the process and sometimes the substance of what they do.
And I'll just say that ranked choice voting is a product of the academy. It's a product of academic research. So anyway, okay. I want to thank the panelists. You guys did great. I have let me be a little bit more official about this. That was so fun. You guys are great. Okay, so thanks to Professor Hutchings, Ocampo, and Jenna Bednar for this in-depth look at the upcoming election. Thanks to everyone for joining. We had over 195 participants today on the video. It's available. The video will be available on the CPS website, the Center for Political Studies website. Please join us next week, Thursday, October 29th at 4 p.m. for an event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of our center. Arthur Lupia will give the keynote address entitled "Now More Than Ever, the Increasing Public Value of Social Science Research." Information about this and future events can be found on our website, cps.isr.umich.edu. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to my colleagues. Great work.